Good morning again. You know, if you have school-aged children, then you know the summer's almost over. And it's hard to believe. And I know a lot of our number are taking advantage of those last few days of summer and out of town. So we're glad that you're here this morning. If you don't have school-aged children, you know that summer's not over until Thanksgiving. So we're glad that we're together this morning. And you picked a good day to be here, by the way. We're starting a brand new sermon series this morning. And I want to begin this morning by giving you all an age test. Okay? I want to find out how old you all are. How many of you recognize this phrase? Conjunction junction, what's your function? Hooking up words and phrases and clauses. Okay? You recognize that phrase? Here's how the age test works. If you recognize that phrase, you're old. Okay? If you recognize that phrase, you probably grew up around the 70s watching Schoolhouse Rock on ABC on Saturday mornings. I think it was resurrected a little bit later than that, but the 70s is kind of what made that show iconic. And all these years later, I still remember conjunction junction. What's your function? And if you remember that, even though you're old, you know what a conjunction is, right? And you know what a bill is, right? I'm just a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. I hope someday I'll be a law, but until I'm a bill. And you know that 3 is a magic number. You know all those things because you grew up watching Schoolhouse Rock. Just by looking at our new sermon series, But God, you probably understand the reason why I'm bringing up conjunctions this morning. And it's amazing how those little tiny conjunctions can mean so much in a conversation and really in a situation. And, or, but. For the next several weeks, we're going to focus on the conjunction but. Pulse rates, smiles, blood pressures, all rise and fall with the use of that little tiny word, but. Now, we really appreciate your application, but I'm going to have to tell you no. I think you're a great person, but let's just be friends. Now, you really did well on the first part of the assignment, but... Or you can use it in the other way, as well. It can mean something completely different. I was going to fire you, but your mom and I were going to ground you, but the doctor said my child would never walk again, but it can make you smile, it can make you happy. And we have to pay attention on how we use that word. I really need to get in shape, but I'm just so busy. I wish I didn't yell at my kids so much, but I'm so frustrated. I really need to have this hard conversation, but I just hate confrontation. More often than not, when I put but right before I, it's usually in the context of some kind of an excuse. But the sermon series isn't entitled, But I. The sermon series is entitled, But God. And when you find those words in Scripture, or when you hear someone use those words in, retelling their story, but God, it's not wrapped in an excuse. It's almost always wrapped in the context of God doing something amazing. Amazing in a life, amazing in a situation. So for the next several weeks, we're going to focus in on some key instances in Scripture where those two words are put together. And I hope that one thing that this series does is sort of cause us to look back on our own lives and to recognize and to remember all of those but God times that have taken place in our lives. And I also hope that maybe if you're going through a difficult season right now, that this series will do something to help you sink your roots deeper and deeper into the love of God, a God who really does make a difference a God who walks along with us, who holds us up as we're waiting for that next but God moment in our own lives. You'll be amazed how many times those two words show up in Scripture. But this morning, we're going to start at the first time they show up in Scripture. If you've been to church very much, you already know that we're headed to the book of Genesis. The very first book of the Bible, the very first time those two words show up together. And we're going to take a look at the story of a guy by the name of Joseph. And I want to, as quickly as I can, give you sort of the Reader's Digest version of this man Joseph's life. You can read it for yourself. It dominates the back half of the book of Genesis. But we need to be reminded of the context that those words, but God, show up. Most of you know this story very well. For you, it'll be a recap, but again, I think it's important. Maybe some of you don't know this story well at all. Joseph was the 12th son born to a man by the name of Jacob. Joseph was his father's favorite son for a couple reasons. He was born in Jacob's old age, plus he was born to Jacob's favorite wife. So Joseph is the favorite son of the favorite wife, and his 11 older brothers do not like that. They don't like the fact that Jacob gives so much attention to their little brother Joseph. They don't like the fact that Joseph is spoiled by their father Jacob, and to be honest, Joseph doesn't do anything to help the family dynamics any. Joseph starts having dreams. And then he starts telling his brothers the meaning of his dreams. And he tells them the meaning of his dreams is, one day you will all bow down to me. And his brothers are like, in your dreams. And Joseph is like, I know. That's what I'm telling you. One day you're all going to bow down to me. So the brothers just get more and more jealous and angry with Joseph. One day, Jacob sends Joseph out into the fields to find them, to kind of check up on him. The brothers see Joseph coming, and in that moment, they devise a plan to take care of their Joseph problem. They decide first that they'll just kill him. But instead, they assault him. They throw him in a pit. They sell him to a caravan that's coming by. They make some money off their little brother. He eventually ends up in Egypt as a slave. The 11 brothers go home, and they tell their dad this wild story about, I think, a wild animal must have killed Joseph. That's all we can figure. So Joseph ends up in slavery in Egypt, and he winds up in the house of a guy by the name of Potiphar, who happens to be the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And we read this in Genesis 39. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. The Lord blessed Joseph living as a slave in the household of Potiphar. Watch this. Joseph has been betrayed by his brothers. He's been sold into slavery. But he winds up being blessed in the very situation that he finds himself in, even though he's there because of betrayal. You know what? God can bless you wherever you are, even if you're in a lousy place, even if it's because of someone else's fault that you're in a lousy place. And not only was God blessing Joseph in that lousy place, he was using Joseph to be a blessing to other people. Now, Joseph is described as a good-looking guy. There's not a whole lot of people in Scripture that are described as good-looking men, but Joseph is one of them. And that fact does not go unnoticed by Potiphar's wife. She sees this good-looking Hebrew guy who is a slave, and she starts making passes at him. She tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph adamantly rejects her advances. So the next day she does it again. And the day after that, and the day after that, until finally one day she just corners Joseph. And she just flat out says, "Come to bed with me." Joseph, in almost a panic, rushes to escape. Potiphar's wife is able to grab his cloak. And because of her embarrassment, because of her rejection, she screams, This guy's trying to assault me. This guy's trying to rape me. She accuses Joseph falsely of making sexual advances towards her. Well, her husband comes home, and he immediately has Joseph thrown into prison. But there's something about this guy, Joseph. While in prison, he proves himself again to be above reproach. And just as God blessed him when he was in Potiphar's home, God is going to bless him in prison. The text tells us that the warden comes to trust Joseph just as Potiphar had trusted Joseph. And the warden gives Joseph responsibilities just as Potiphar had. By the way, that image is, I had AI create that image for me. And I want you to know that I know there's something wrong with that picture. Okay? You can tell me what it is later, but just so you know, I know there's something wrong with that picture. But Joseph is in prison. Now you spend the rest of the time trying to figure out what it is. But when he was in prison, he didn't have a coat of many colors. Okay? That's it. Okay. Two of the other prisoners that were doing time with Joseph actually worked in the court of Pharaoh himself, the cupbearer and a baker. And as it turns out, they start having dreams. And they tell Joseph his dreams because Joseph says, I've got a little experience with dreams myself. And so they tell him their dreams. Joseph interprets their dreams. Joseph's interpretation of their dreams is spot on, which is really good news for the cupbearer. It's really bad news for the baker. But the cupbearer is released from prison to go back and work again for Pharaoh. Joseph begs the cupbearer before his release, when you get back in Pharaoh's court, remember me. The cupbearer promises, I will remember you. The cupbearer does not remember Joseph. This multi-year roller coaster for Joseph continues. He has been twice betrayed. Now he's been forgotten. Eventually, Pharaoh himself starts having dreams. And he calls his seers in for them to interpret his dreams, but none of them can. The cupbearer hears about Pharaoh's dreams, and the cupbearer says, hey, I know a guy. He's in your prison. He's a Hebrew, but I think he might be able to help you. So, Pharaoh calls for Joseph. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. He says there's going to be 7 great years of plenty. There's going to be 7 years of bumper crops, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. You need to prepare for the famine in those 7 years. Pharaoh says, okay, since you did the interpretation, I want you in charge, Joseph, of the administration. And he places Joseph in charge of collecting grain, collecting food during the 7 years of plenty to be ready for the 7 years of famine. The famine hits, just as Joseph had predicted. During the famine, Egypt, thanks to Joseph, has plenty of food. They have grain stored, not just for themselves, but for the surrounding regions as well. And you remember the old saying, be careful the bridges you burn, you might have to cross back over one. Years and years after selling Joseph into slavery, his brothers show up in Egypt looking to buy some grain. And wouldn't you know it, they find themselves standing before Joseph. They don't realize it's Joseph, their brother, that they are standing in front of. Joseph does, but he controls himself. He doesn't reveal himself till the second time that they show back up, but then finally he lets his guard down, and we see a really powerful emotional moment in Genesis 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. I don't know how many times you've ever heard a grown man weep loudly. Probably not very often. But if you have, it's memorable, and it's unsettling, and it's a little bit unnerving. Joseph is second in command to Egypt, and before his brothers he is undone. He is weeping loudly. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." These brothers are completely shocked to see that Joseph is alive and in this position. They are completely terrified to see that Joseph is alive and in this position. They understand that Joseph would end their lives with just a word, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he sends them back home, saying, "Go get your dad, go get your family, and come live here in Egypt." And they do. In fact, when they get back, Joseph gives them the best part of the land to live in. So they're living in Egypt as a family. After several years, Jacob dies. Dad's dead. And then the brothers get very nervous. And finally, we arrive at our text. There's your context. Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly." They make up a story to tell Joseph about their dead father. "Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When the message came to him, Joseph wept. Amazing. His brothers are still trying to deceive him. They betray him. They sell him into slavery when he's young because they're so jealous of him. Now they're trying to deceive him as he's old because they're so afraid of him. After all that time, after 17 years living together in Egypt, that's how long it's been. It's been 17 years that they've all been together in Egypt. After 17 years of living in the best part of the land, after 17 years of Joseph treating them like royalty, they still don't trust their little brother Joseph. Are you paying attention? Because some of you know some family dynamics that have that kind of drama. Lack of trust, lies that have been told, betrayal has taken place. And maybe someone, maybe you, trying to kind of move things forward in grace, but there's just no trust there. Verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. Kind of ironic. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So there's our conjunction for this morning. But God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. But God intended trumps anything that the brothers had intended. But God intended means that what began with betrayal, what began with being beaten by my brothers and sold into slavery, what continued with being falsely accused by the man that I'm trying to do such a good job for, and being thrown into prison where I had to live as a prisoner, although I did my best to honor my God, and what continued as being forgotten in prison, ends up with me being here in this position right now, saving not just all of Egypt, but the surrounding regions and you, my family. But God intended it for good. So we know these stories, we study these stories, we retell these stories, and we all conclude, because we're church people, we all conclude, yes, God can bring good out of a bad situation. And then we find ourselves in our bad situation. And we're trying to figure, how can I get myself out of this? Because somehow we seem to forget that God's at work even in bad situations. So let me give you just a couple takeaways as we start to wrap this thing up. The first is this. When God is with us, it makes no difference who's against us. We can still bloom for His purpose. When God is with us, it really makes no difference who's against us. We can still bloom for His purpose. Even though Joseph was betrayed into slavery, he still bloomed there in Potiphar's house. He was put in charge. Even though he was falsely accused of rape, thrown into prison, he still bloomed there in prison. Again, he was put in charge. Even though he was forgotten, when he needed help from the very person that he helped, he still bloomed for God's purpose. When God's with you, it makes no difference who's against you. You can still bloom. And again, some of you are where you are in your life right now because you've been done wrong by someone. You've been forgotten. You've been maybe betrayed. And just because you've been forgotten, betrayed, done wrong, doesn't mean that God can't still bless you where you are. Doesn't mean that you still can't bloom. There's a great statement that Joseph makes in Genesis 41. It's kind of an incredible statement that he makes. You need to underline it. You need to highlight it somehow. He says this, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. I love the heart behind that statement. God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Can I be fruitful in the land of my suffering? If God is with me, I like my chances. Because God doesn't waste pain. Joseph says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And you know what that tells me? That God being with me isn't some cosmic insurance policy that makes sure nothing bad is ever going to happen to me. Not at all. You know, a lot of people think, well, as long as, I'm following God, nothing bad will ever happen to me. Joseph would like a few minutes for rebuttal. I think Joseph would disagree with that statement. God being with you doesn't mean that your life is never going to be pain-free, challenge-free, betrayal-free. What it does mean is in the land of your suffering, He is the way forward. There's another great verse made by another great guy of God back in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 2, where Nehemiah, kind of looking back over his own life, the adversity of his life, says, our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. God turned the curse into a blessing. Yeah, I want some of that. Our God turned the curse into a blessing. And I am sure if you are honest with yourself, and you're honest with God, you can look back on your own life. And with the help of, some time and distance, we can see times in our own life when, oh boy, God turned a curse into a blessing. And what a difference it made. Which leads to a second takeaway from the story of Joseph. It is possible to believe that God's intentions for good trumps what's intended for harm, and yet still grieve the pain. It's possible to believe that what God intends for good absolutely trumps what is intended for harm, but it still hurts. In Genesis chapter 45 and Genesis chapter 50, Joseph finds himself absolutely convinced that what people intended for harm, God intended for good. He's absolutely convinced of that. And yet in both of those chapters, we see Joseph as a blubbering mess. He's crying when he reveals himself to his brothers. He's crying again in chapter 50 when he realizes that his brothers still don't trust him. Joseph wants you to know there is room for both belief and grief. Whatever season you might be in your life, there is room for belief and grief. And I think sometimes we as Christians, we feel guilty if we're grieving something. I must not have enough belief because this is hard and this hurts and there's heartache. No. Joseph would tell you, you can believe and still grieve. You're in a hard season, but God's with you. And God is going to do something good in the middle of that hard season, but you can still grieve it. And I think sometimes other people see grief as a lack of faith on our behalf. Now, well, if you just trusted God, you wouldn't be sad. Don't be sad, trust God. Listen, please never say that to someone who's sad. Never tell someone who's hurting, well, just trust God. Don't be sad. Please don't say that. It is absolutely possible, in fact, it's natural. While I'm trusting God, I am grieving the situation that's taken place around me. And I'm hurting. And I'm struggling. I trust God. But it's still difficult. It is possible to believe and to grieve. Joseph did. But he didn't stay there. So he did something else. Here's one last takeaway. Maintain integrity even through adversity. And use your gifts even in obscurity. One of the things I love about the story of Joseph is the faithfulness pattern that you see in the life of Joseph. He winds up in slavery because he's betrayed. He is still using his gifts to bless Potiphar and Potiphar's household. Then he winds up in prison because he's been falsely accused. He's still using the gifts that he has of leadership and organization to bless the warden and the other prisoners. Joseph's focus stays on God. He's forgotten by the cupbearer. His focus stays on God. He's a man of integrity, even in adversity. And he uses his gifts, even in obscurity. You know, some of us live most of our lives in obscurity, don't we? You know, in the grand scheme of things, not too many people know what I'm doing. Not too many people know what's going on in my life, in my situation. And it would be very easy to say, well, nobody knows, so who would care? Again, Joseph would disagree with that conclusion. You can use what God has given you, even in a place where you'd rather not be. Again, Joseph is using his gifts while he's a slave in Potiphar's home, while he's a prisoner. He's using what he has, where he has, in total obscurity. But he's keeping and living with integrity in the midst of his adversity. And I think that's how God allowed him to stay in a position to be used in such a powerful way by God. So this morning, as we kind of rewind this story of Joseph that most of us know so well, if we look back on times when God has made him fruitful in the land of his suffering, I hope that we can look back on our own lives and see times when God has turned a curse into a blessing in our own life. And maybe look around us at the things that some of us are going through right now. A place where maybe you've been betrayed. Someone has lied to you or about you. You feel like you're in a pit. You feel like you're in a prison. Nobody knows. Nobody seems to care. But man, it's painful. Maybe you feel forgotten. But God. But God is still at work. But God is still paying attention. And but God is still God. Thank you, Joseph, for reminding us of that truth. As a church family, if we can help you, pray with you, maybe cry with you over something that's going on in your life, we would love to know about that. We're going to stand and we've got a song we're going to sing. If you'd meet us here at the front of the auditorium, we'd love to talk to you. Let's go ahead and stand and we'll be singing.